When have you found yourself in a position where you thought, yup, this is how I die? Mountain lion encounter on my mountain bike. I basically pooped my pants when I saw that thing around a switchback. I'm sure the scent scared the cat away. My local nuclear power plant sent out an SMS alert to evacuate the area. It was 8 AM on a Sunday, and I was rudely woken by alarms ringing from my phone. After powering through my morning dry eye to read the blurry message saying run for the hills, my only thought was, welp, it was a good life. Might as well die doing what I love most. That is sleeping. And I went back to sleep. Luckily it was a false alarm, some dude from the plant got fired. Edit. Wow, this is the most upvotes I ever got with my 2 years on Reddit. Thank you all. On the way home from work, had my very first panic attack. I was sure I was having a heart attack. And to be honest, I did not try to call for help. My first panic attack, I thought I was having a heart attack also. At the ripe old age of 22. I also didn't call for help. But I did write goodbye letters to both of my kids. All the stomach discomfort I've had for the last 8 months, caused by an H. pylori infection which caused severe gastritis and several ulcers to form in my gut. I've literally forgotten what it feels like to feel normal. All day, every day I have hella discomfort in my stomach. Some days I start to worry that I have stomach cancer and they just haven't picked it up yet. I've lost almost all hope of returning to normal and feeling better. As if COVID anxiety wasn't enough. Fudge 2020. I was backpacking along the Appalachian Trail in Great Smoky Mountain National Park the week after Thanksgiving a couple years back, where the forecast was for highs in the low 50s, lows in the low 40s. Great backpacking weather. I'm a very experienced hiker, was out solo, and had been dropped off with a plan to be picked up 4 days later. Second day when I got to the shelter and pulled out the weather radio, I discovered that the weather forecast took a massive turn for the worse, and that a big winter storm was rolling in. That night, the wind was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It just roared constantly for the entire evening, while the temps plummeted. I woke up to a couple of inches of snow on the ground. But the wind and precip had stopped. I ate breakfast and geared up to head out. It was still overcast, but not overly so, and I was really looking forward to the beautiful winter wonderland I was going to be walking through. I even stopped a couple of times in the first hour or two to take some awesome pictures. Around the third hour, the weather again took a massive turn. The temps started falling again. The wind picked up, and it started snowing again. Within 30 minutes of the snow starting, I was in whiteout conditions. At this point, I was closer to the next shelter than to the previous, so I made the decision to keep going. Turns out, this was a mistake. The part of the trail I was on was a very exposed ridge line, and the driving winds and temps in the single digits demanded that I keep moving. I quickly discovered that all of my water had frozen, but I drank quite a bit in before I broke camp. So I figured I could hold out until I reached the next shelter. I had snacks in my waist belt, so at least I could eat as I walked. I'd figured 6 hours of hiking between shelters, and given conditions I figured another 2. At 9 hours out I began to get worried. I was very cold, very thirsty, and very tired. At 10 hours I figured that I had missed the side trail for the shelter thanks to the whiteout conditions. I knew that the next shelter was visible from the trail, so really my only choice was to keep walking. Around 14 hours out from the last shelter, I began to consider my emergency options. I was dehydrated, physically exhausted, and starting to show signs of hypothermia. When I'm out solo, I carry an emergency locator beacon. I've done a lot of solo trips, and never once even considered activating it. Because of the conditions it was difficult for me to gauge my speed, so I had no idea how much further the next shelter was. I couldn't set up my shelter where I was because the snow had already gotten too deep, and there wasn't enough level ground to do so anyway. Once again, my only option was to keep moving. It was difficult for me to even pick up my feet at this point, but I kept trudging on. I knew if I stopped, as cold and dehydrated as I was, I'd likely die. Activating the ELB would only guide rescuers to my body. Around 20 minutes after this, I came back into a wooded area, which cut the wind and snow somewhat. Thankfully, I always study my maps before I leave camp, and I knew from the start of the wood line was another 5 miles to the next shelter, another 2 hours, and I finally arrived at the next shelter. 17 hours of basically non-stop walking in temps in the high single digits to low teens. Winds strong enough to push you around. Constant snow, no water, and only a couple of handfuls of frozen beef jerky and gorp. As I started setting up camp in the shelter, I found my boots caked in ice and snow caked all over my pack. I set up my stove, melted my water, and had the best hot meal I've ever had. In the night the weather broke, and I woke up to amazingly beautiful blue skies. Because I'd hiked double the distance I'd meant to, I was a day ahead of schedule. I decided to just chill at the shelter, the ironically and appropriately named Ice Water Spring Shelter, enjoy the beautiful weather and smoke a well-deserved joint. The next day my wife and son met me at Newfound Gap and I regaled them with my adventure as we drove into Gatlinburg for a nice winter family vacation. I passed a kidney stone at the peak of my first shrooms trip. I pity you and your experiences. Never did shrooms, but I stubbed my toe on acid, and I thought my foot just fucking fell off. Turned out what I thought was my foot on the ground a few feet from where I was laying was my roommate's fleshlight. Thankfully in my trip I didn't try to shove it back onto my leg to reattach my foot. I lived with the guy a single month and him leaving his sex toys around was the only reason I moved out. A friend of mine was on acid and walking down a street when he got egged. He had his headphones on and was listening to a rap song about drive-bys and immediately assumed that he had been shot. He clutched his stomach and yelled, "They got me," before falling down and realizing that he was not suffering from a gunshot wound and that he was not bleeding. The moisture he felt was just egg yolks. I was driving at night on the interstate, going down a steep grade. Warning signs for semi-trucks steep. I hit a thunderstorm that was a wall of water. The road wasn't shedding it fast enough. I can't see Sugar and I'm completely hydroplaning, so no steering and no brakes. The road wasn't straight either, so I'm certain I'm going off one side or the other at 70 miles per hour. I honestly don't know how I made it down that hill alive. Just held the wheel straight, kept my feet off the pedals, and accepted that might be the end. Made it to the bottom and started to naturally slow down until regained traction. Got off at the next exit to pick the upholstery out of my ass and let the storm pass. I don't envy you that. My scariest driving experience was driving through West Virginia and the Maryland Panhandle when a snowstorm blew in. Nighttime. Mostly empty roads. I could barely see the lanes. And at one point I was just following the quickly disappearing tire tracks left by other cars in the snow and hoping they hadn't driven off course. I'm glad I had chosen to take my own car, not a rental. So I was comfortable with the car as can be. Rain would be worse though, like you said, since you were actually hydroplaning. I stupidly took mushrooms with some friends, just as the pandemic was kicking off. Couldn't stop coughing all of a sudden. Then had shooting pains down my side. Spiraled from there until I was an absolute sweaty mess. On a bed, clenching my chest in pain. Telling my friends to tell my parents and partner I love them. Ambulance picked me up. Hospital ran a whole bunch of tests. Turns out panic attacks, shrooms, and pandemics don't go well together. Laying in puke. Totally awake but unable to talk or move. Breath getting shallow and don't have the energy to breathe. Passed out. Then I felt like someone was sitting on my chest. Thank God it was my girlfriend leaning over me with her hand on my chest administering nasal Narcan. Long to short. Don't do heroin. Clean 11 years. I've got a good one. Delivered pizza in college. One time in 2017. Just before Christmas. It's snowing and I pull up to this house with like 5 pizzas. A lady opens the door and asks if I'd like to come inside out of the cold. This is pretty common. So I say sure. When I walk in I'm immediately blinded with the flash of a big, old times Polaroid camera. When I get my vision back, I notice there's more than a dozen people standing around, staring at me. The only thing I could think was okay, this is how I die. I'm about to be sacrificed or something. Apostrophe. Turns out every year for Christmas they get together and donate money to a random delivery person as their family's way of giving back. tip me $200. The first time I had sushi I didn't know what wasabi was and ate the whole blob at once. For those first 20 seconds I thought I had cremated my brain. Being stung by an Irukandji jellyfish and being misdiagnosed, I had an anaphylactic reaction to the sting. Subsequently had a heart attack and was revived. All because I was misdiagnosed in hospital. I had surgery to fix a hole in my heart and was prescribed some pretty good painkillers. I took some and went to bed, but then woke up in the middle of the night in a lot of pain. I was groggy and half asleep and took some more and then realized that only 30 minutes had passed since I'd fallen asleep. I made it to the foot of my bed before I went down. I also ended up developing a blood clot because of the surgery afterwards. But for a long time the doctors and surgeons couldn't agree on whether it was a clot or a tumor. Literally right until I was about to get prepped for open heart surgery. As it turned out, I didn't need it. When my car was in the air upside down, and I was surprised to realize I was not afraid. I accepted my death was near. Yep, flying through the air. This is not good. Friend picked me up for her birthday dinner at a restaurant about 30 minutes away. On the way there she starts downing one after another of those one-shot mini bottles you can get at the liquor store. I had never seen her drink and drive, and never expected her to do that. I couldn't get out of the car because we weren't stopping along the way, so I just sat there in the passenger seat as her driving got more and more erratic, drifting over the double yellow, speeding, swerving, all while making comments about how she was starting to feel the effects of the alcohol. I was terrified that this was going to be it. We would crash and die, especially because my BF was nearly killed when his close friend drove drunk and flipped his car. The only reason he lived was because he survived not only being ejected out the back windshield, but being ejected saved his life because the spot where he was sitting got crushed. So I was replaying that image in my mind while this was going on. Thankfully we made it in one piece. But I was pissed, especially because all my friends acted so nonchalant about it. Ended up taking an Uber home fuming after dinner was over. Drinking and driving is never acceptable. Please click subscribe if you enjoyed this video.